Kevin Johnson, and I am an Innovation in Global Development PhD student here at the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. We have had 3 previous talks this semester. Nina Berman provided us with decolonizing economic theory, and it was a great talk. Gary Dirks, Decolonizing Development, and Maria Rosaria Jackson gave a talk on arts and culture indicators for healthy communities. And we've been having these talks. They are all student-led and organized, and we'll also have a series of talks next semester as well that Megan will detail later. So the IGD program, just to give you an idea of the program itself, has a strong global focus and is designed to address the mismatch between what students often learn in school and undergraduate, graduate work, and what they encounter with the complexities of development in the real world. And so the IGD program was designed to address that. And it's actually our first semester for the program here this semester. I want to take the time to introduce Dr. David Guston, who is both a professor and the founding director for the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. He's also a co-director of the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, principal investigator and director of the Center for Nanotechnology and Society, which is a National Science Foundation-funded nanoscale science and engineering center. Quite a mouthful, but he's an accomplished faculty member here at ASU, widely published and cited in research. And so we are going to have Dr. Guston, if he will come and moderate the panel discussion that we have today. He will also introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to see that the IGD doctoral program has gotten off to such a terrific start. I want to acknowledge Netra Chetri, who's the director of the program. Thank you. And to have, in really its first semester of operation, such an active intellectual program is a real compliment to Netra's leadership and to the students of the program. So thank you for bringing this, not just making it for yourselves, but bringing it to the rest of the School for the Future of Innovation Society and to the rest of ASU. So I am moderating this panel on development reimagined. Just let me say one little thing about the reimagined part, and this is now my imagination, but Netra and his colleagues around development in the School for the Future of Innovation Society many years ago now, it's probably about 8 years ago, Netra, started a conversation around what they called alternative imaginations. And this was the beginnings of a robust discussion about how it is that we imagine the interrelationship between people, communities, technology, and development, and trying to bring different perspectives, different lenses, not just traditional economics, policy analysis, public policy, political science, global development perspective on these questions, but a whole set of things like grassroots innovation, indigenous knowledges, science fiction, and so forth, to conversations about what development was about, what the role of technology in development was, and thinking about how to do it in not just a more productive, but a more holistic and humanistic fashion. And I think these conversations are continuous with discussions that had begun before the school was created for a number of years. I'm really thrilled to see these conversations continue and be embedded in the PhD program, and looking forward to seeing that develop even further as the PhD program grows and prospers. So to introduce the panel now, I'd like, as I'm introducing them, they can come up and and take seats. This will be, as I understand, the only PowerPoint slide you will see during the day, or during this hour, so that I think that's fabulous. Another alternative way of doing it. And I'll start in order of the speaking roles that people will have. So José Lobo. Jose is an associate research professor in the School of Sustainability here at ASU. He was originally trained in physics before getting a PhD in urban economics, so he embodies the interdisciplinary spread that we love to find here at ASU. He's interested in the determinants of metropolitan economic performance and location-specific economic growth, relationship between urbanization and socioeconomic development across time, the causes and consequences of urban size and scale, and how the characteristics of individuals, organizations, institutions, and social networks interact to create regions of innovation. So Jose, why don't you come on up? Let me introduce the other two speakers as well. Pamela Delargy. She is a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies, which was my home academic unit before I became director of the School for the Future of Innovation Society, but that was way back when it was the Political Science Department. She is a public health and population specialist who is rejoining academia after a 20-year career in international development and humanitarian response, where she worked in the areas of population and development, migration, gender and development, including reproductive health. So Pamela, come on up and join Jose. And then finally, Nina Berman. Nina is the director of and professor in the School of International Letters and Cultures here at ASU. Her research areas include globalization studies, humanitarianism, tourism, German Orientalism and colonialism, Germans in Africa, and intercultural hermeneutics. She has held previous teaching appointments at Ohio State, UT Austin, and a guest professorship at Göttingen recently. So we're going to start with Jose. The speakers will speak in turn, then I'll come up and maybe ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll get to the audience. So Jose, please.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thank everybody for us to come here. So I'll try to really stick to my 10 minutes. So by the end of this century, maybe before, a process that humans started about 11,000 years ago will be completed. And by that time, most human beings will be living in cities, which for a species will be a tremendous change. Between now and then, the vast majority of that growth in urban population will occur in cities in the so-called developing world. The urbanization process is basically complete in North America and in Europe. And we have a lot of evidence that the vast majority of the urban growth that we are going to witness in the next few decades will consist of expansions in what are sometimes called slums or informal settlements. Now, if you ask what percentage of that expansion in urban population will be living in slums, the most honest answer is we don't know. And the reason we don't know was pointed out about over a decade ago by the United Nations, when they pointed out that there is a crisis of information when it comes to knowing just how many people live in slums. I can tell you from personal experience, you go to Mumbai, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Cape Town, and you ask the mayors, how many people, how many of your citizens live in slums? If they're honest, they will say they don't know. Often they will give you sort of guesses. Okay? So I will argue that if by development we mean improvements in the human condition so that people don't go hungry, are not afraid, and do not sleep or defecate on the streets. Development will really have to tackle the challenges of urban development and the role of slums and informal settlements. That is my reimagining of development. Now, I believe that there are various reasons, things that have happened, that make it possible to imagine a very different way in which urban growth can be managed, a very different way in which urban planning can take place, and make it not seem like an old-fashioned Marxist fantasy, and I have to confess I'm a recovering Marxist, to involve the poor in urban planning, and actually involve them, not just say you're going to involve them. So for one thing is that there's been a tremendous increase in scientific understanding in the role of informal neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods in urban development, not only in contemporary urban areas, but in the past. We here at ASU have some of the leading archaeologists who are studying the role of slums in poor neighborhoods in ancient cities. And we are beginning to understand that those poor neighborhoods play a very important role. They're not just simply seeds of misery, undifferentiated poor. So we have some scientific input going on. We now have technologies that make it possible for us to address some of the information gaps and not have to wait for the statistical bureaus of India or Mexico or South Africa to actually conduct a census of the poor in urban cities. That's not going to happen. That I can believe. So we don't have to wait for that to happen. We do have now technologies to make it easier to do the absolutely first indispensable step if you really want to involve the poor in development, which is you have to count them and you have to acknowledge where they are. I also believe that there are organizational changes that have occurred in the last 10 years development by which the slum dwellers throughout the world have organized themselves, have come together. They're also realizing that they're just not going to wait for that to be counted. And so I think that at this moment, I believe that there is no scientific, there's no technological, and there's certainly no moral excuse not to work and involve the poor in urban development. There might be political excuses, but those, I think, can be overcome. I would think is a task of our scholars to help in overcoming that. I think it's not just a matter of I would say there's just an imperative of decency to collaborate with the poor. But I think the recent election in Brazil holds a warning. If you ignore the needs as they state them of the urban poor. I am not going to compare the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro, with Trump, whether favorably or negatively. I'll leave that exercise to you. But I think what is sometimes overlooked in the outside world's shock at how could someone like Bolsonaro be elected is that Bolsonaro not only won, as you would have expected, perhaps the vote of the Brazilian rich, he carried the favelas. He won in the favelas. He was able to tap into long-standing frustration. If you ever visit the favelas in Brazil, and you ask the residents of those favelas, what do you want? They will tell you. It's not a mystery. They give you a list. They tell you, we want this, that, and the other. And for decades, progressives in Brazil, people like us, simply either ignore those calls, or it's almost like we had no language for, well, yes, what do you want? Well, I would like for there to be a decrease in crime. Well, I'll tell you what. Once there's a complete transformation in society and we have a socialist revolution and we have overthrown the rich capitalists, we will address that problem. Okay. When you find a satisfying answer, you have a problem, and the answer is, once we completely redesign society, your problem will be addressed. So if you have visited favelas, you will ask the residents of favelas, what is your big issue, especially for women? Well, safety. Safety. I would like to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go to a communal bathroom and not be raped or killed. Very basic demand. Now, you might not agree with Bolsonaro's. Bolsonaro's approach is, I'll solve the safety problem for you, just don't ask me how. And yes, I might violate the Constitution of human rights, but I'll solve this problem. And I think that's a kind of a warning that if we're going to engage with the poor, and we ask them what you want, then we need to take seriously. So for me, reimagining development is work with the poor, take their needs seriously, and then together with them design how we're going to address it. And I believe that scientifically and technologically we are now in a position to do so. It's just a matter of whether we, scholars, want to work with them or not. So that's my reimagining, which I hope is not my old self. It's not an all-star Marxist fantasy repackaged. Who knows? And I think it was under 10 minutes.
Okay, this is a hard act to follow, but I ask you to change continents and look in another place which is in the news over the weekend and over the last 3 months. Many of you probably don't follow what's going on in Sudan, which is Africa and the Middle East's biggest country. But if you watch right now, you'll find something very, very exciting and also frightening. The popular overthrow of a 30-year-old regime, which nobody, including all Sudanese experts, predicted could possibly happen. And I'm going to use Sudan as an example of a couple of things that Jose has already alluded to as well. In an effort to raise some questions about what development is, what has happened in the whole industry of development assistance and receipt of development assistance, which I know that Nina has already talked about too in terms of the decolonization process. Sudan, a huge country, phenomenal agricultural possibilities, minerals, every reason to believe that it should be a very well-functioning, poverty-free country, which has suffered for 30 years under a very, very autocratic regime, quite a corrupt regime, initially brought through Salafism and influence of Islamists from Saudi Arabia, etc., which infiltrated all the cultural, economic, political institutions. And over the past 6 days, millions of people, majority women and girls, by the way, in the streets surrounding the Ministry of Defense and the President's office, and the 30-year-old head of Sudan resigned 4 days ago. Then a second guy who came to power resigned after 24 hours. Now there's a third guy, head of a military council, who is negotiating still with the people's representatives to see how they can establish a civilian prime ministership and what should be done with all the militias and all kinds of military craziness going on in Sudan. But it's kind of an interesting case study because the people who have led this whole revolution actually were the Sudan Professionals Association. Doctors, engineers, accountants, bankers, those who came out of universities, tremendous role of university faculty in this, as well as those from all the different parts of Sudan which had been marginalized for many, many years and impoverished. So it's been a kind of interesting attention of the elites, educated elites, to the interest of the marginalized. Sudan, too, is a country that has undergone tremendous urbanization. But I would ask the question whether urbanization is a natural process or whether it was a result of a failure of development, a failure of attention to rural areas, a failure of attention to pastoralists who make up maybe 1/4, 1/3 of the population who move with herds in a very environmentally sustainable lifestyle, but now have been cut off because of conflict or national borders or that sort of thing. A failure of rural people to access any kind of services as things became concentrated in urban areas and politicized. I think it's not unusual for urbanization to show both a natural process of human beings migrating, but also a failure of attention to other areas. And that is the case in the US, I think, as well. And this is also asks an interesting question about what about the political power of these rural people. In Sudan, there's a stranglehold on political power for a long time by very small minorities because they knew they could make a lot of trouble. These were pastoralists going back and forth across national boundaries and everything. So these are kinds of things that oddly, and I reinforce what Jose says, the traditional development industry and patterns of assistance have not paid sufficient attention to at all in terms of looking at poverty reduction strategies, in terms of looking at service delivery, in terms of looking at gender, in terms of looking at environment. In fact, so many of the longer term support for a country like Sudan, so much of the longer term support, even if it focused on agriculture, say, and encouraged a lot of investment in agricultural production, supported exactly the wrong kind of agricultural production. Supported mechanized agriculture, which then led to huge amounts of environmental degradation and displacement from the land and played its whole role in climate change, which then played its whole role in a civil war and the displacement of millions of people in Darfur. So we have a kind of periodic trend. Oh, all the donors, let's do mechanized agriculture. Oh no, let's do this other thing. Without sufficient attention to the local expertise, which could have predicted very well, there were a lot of good environmental scientists in Sudan, could have predicted that this was going to happen. Which just leads me to summarize very quickly my concerns or worries about the possibility of the whole development assistance industry being innovative. This is a tough one because it's an industry which has developed kinds of relationships and structures over many, many, many years. There are many individuals, many governments, many ministries of development assistance or foreign affairs whose sheer existence depend on this structure being maintained. We have very interesting changes recently in the whole development assistance framework and development financing. Traditional model of overseas development assistance, investment bilaterally and through multilateral institutions and through the World Bank, etc., which has actually been declining in the past couple of years. So if we're looking for more support for all these new ideas, we have a challenge because development assistance is stagnating or even declining in some cases. Often because it has actually been substituted by humanitarian assistance. As development fails, crises increase, resiliency of local populations to natural disasters decline, requiring ever more humanitarian assistance. So what we've seen over the past 20, 25 years is a shift where as emergency assistance has somehow started to substitute for longer-term thinking and development assistance. And I can use Sudan as an example again, where we had huge amounts of funding going into Darfur and Western Sudan, all of which was called humanitarian assistance, some of which was actually development, but it had to be called that way for political reasons. So this financing issue is interesting. We're seeing now an increase in private sector financing. The question is whether this will pay any attention at all to the things that Jose talked about. We're seeing China coming in, supporting infrastructure everywhere for their own reasons. And we're seeing a kind of state-centeredness of whatever sort of assistance there is, which does not necessarily include civil society or include people or include local communities. I just say one quick word too about the interesting data issues. I was involved in census taking in many countries over the years, and it is another interesting political issue and process, but the attention of donors, in my experience, has not been so much on the actual data of what is happening, but in establishing many of their own measures of accountability for organizations. In my organization, relatively small compared to others, we had to hire 3 people full-time simply to do the measurement of all the new accountability indicators established by DFID, the UK Development Organization. Every development donor is coming up with more and more indicators of accountability, which are pretty mechanical, actually. They're not really measuring what is happening, but they are under pressure from their own taxpayers to show that the aid given is accountable, but they don't have the kind of data that they really need to show that something really is making a difference on the ground.
I would prefer to stand, so I'll be here. So we have already had 2 amazing statements here, and what I'm going to say really in many ways builds on what we just heard. And the question for me is, or of the comments that I'll be making, which are entitled Educating Future Developers. So the question is, how do we include the insights from the field, the insights from people who have been working in the field for many years, and people who are also have been studying development in our educational programs. So how can we educate future development workers so that they can address these kind of issues that Pamela and José just described? So I want to focus on 3 main points, namely the relevance of historical knowledge, the relevance of cultural and linguistic literacy, and the training and practices of inclusive and solidary development. To the first point on history, and this is sort of having a little bit the tone of a manifesto here, maybe I'll write a manifesto about this sometime. So, On the Destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas was published in 1543 and is the first text on genocide in the Americas, and arguably the first critique of globalization. A development worker who has not read this text will not be able to understand the full weight of the historical alliance between economic exploitation and humanitarian discourses, from colonialism and the Christian mission to today's nexus of neoliberalism and humanitarianism. And that's what Pamela actually spoke to in some ways. A development worker who does not know that literacy came to Africa not with European colonialism, but with Islam starting in the 7th century, will not understand the to-date largely unacknowledged history of African literacy and science. A development worker who has not heard about Edmund Wilmot Blyden or Henry Sylvester Williams has not sufficiently engaged with African and African diaspora intellectual history. A development worker who has not read Tagore's very timely On Nationalism, published in 1900, cannot appreciate the extent of the Asian intellectual engagement with European imperialism and the coevalness of the modernization process. A development worker who does not know what Bando stands for will also not understand how China today can move into Africa by drawing on historical alliances that are not on the radar of, for example, USAID. That was on the first point, historical knowledge. Second one, cultural and linguistic literacy. Everything changes when you can speak with your interlocutors in the local language, or at least in one of the languages that is spoken in the country. Most people on our planet are tri- or quadrilingual, and arguably American monolingualism is quite unique and a puzzling phenomenon. Even just a few phrases in the local language are likely to help a development worker to win the trust of local stakeholders. And winning trust we must. Development workers are up against a lot of distrust. The smiles a development worker encounters on the ground in Africa and Asia and the Americas are smiles that have to be deciphered very carefully. A development worker who does not understand that fact will not be able to succeed. Becoming a specialist in a region is a long-term project, but specialization may be the best way to address the challenges regarding cultural and linguistic literacy. Rather than crisscrossing the planet, careers of development workers should aim for groundedness in locations. And in some ways, I think a development worker who operates without linguistic and cultural literacy is like an engineer without math skills. I do think that this is really essential. The last point on practices of inclusive and solidary development, in a way, are closely related to these first points that I made, which are the foundation of inclusive and solidary development. So practices, pursuing a training and practices of inclusive and solidary development is really contingent of awareness about historical factors and linguistic and cultural literacy. Approaches to inclusive and solidary development must begin at the level of conception. Local stakeholders must be brought into the conversation. This resonates with what both José and Pamela have said. So must brought into the conversation before any concrete plans are developed. Even better, local stakeholders would decide where and how and when a project is appropriate, and as you know, there's a lot of literature on this topic. I even would want to suggest that the term development, the way it is currently used, gestures to north to south relationships that should be questioned. And development is really not just relevant to the global south. Arizona, for example, has much in common with Kenya, the country that I study presently. Like Kenya, Arizona needs to figure out issues around water, drought, energy, mining, indigenous populations, land ownership and land titling, illegal immigration, border security, trafficking of drugs and people, poverty, and education. In fact, Kenya and Arizona have the exact same murder rate as another dimension here. Approaching development from a truly global perspective through innovative collaborative projects. So, for example, bringing Kenyans and people from Arizona to the table to think about, through comparison, trying to find solutions to these various issues is essential to developing successful approaches to development that are grounded in concepts of solidarity. So, in conclusion, as used presently, the term development is intrinsically colonial, neo-colonial, and neoliberal. Hopefully, development workers who are educated about the ideological baggage of the term, are linguistically and culturally literate, and engage with local stakeholders from a place of solidarity, will be able to transform the connotation, these connotations. So, and I hope that in our discussion we can talk about what that means for curriculum at ASU. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to our three speakers for being interesting, being provocative, being on time. And so I think we're going to have the opportunity to have a good conversation with our audience. I've also been charged with, moderating or mediating what you guys have done with the audience. And I don't think I want to spend too much time with either synthesizing my own thoughts or asking you to go deeper, but I will just take one little opportunity, I think, following on to Nina's last comments about, if we're sensitive to history, culture, and language, we've got this utterly fraught word that we're stuck with, it seems, development. And, we've incorporated it into the titles of our degrees because we need to signal to an audience that is steeped in this, and those are the people who are acting in this world and who are the folks that we need to identify to come to us, even if it's to learn how to undermine that as well. So, I mean, is there a way, other than a longer-term general shift in the connotation of development, is there a more focused way that we should be thinking about naming this activity? And I'll actually ask all three of you, because all three of you have some at least implicit, if not explicit, thoughts about that. So Nina, and then Pamela, and then Jose, and then we'll get to the audience.
Okay, does this work? Yeah, it works. Well, I mean, what I was saying is that if we have more knowledge, more consciousness about, if we, in our courses, teach about this history, and if there are degree requirements that force students or really enable students to engage with cultural and acquire cultural and linguistic literacy, and if perhaps the focus is not just on the global south, but if we design our projects so that they include areas of the overdeveloped world, to use Paul Gilroy's term, then I think we'll shift the connotations. We can shift what the term stands for.
Pamela?
Gosh, I don't know. I liked what Jose said earlier when he was saying, what is development? Where people have enough to eat and they're not defecating on the street and they have all the basic things they need to live a dignified life. And I think that this is it's a dilemma when we think about it. Of course, it's a very kind of Western, Northern concept, the whole notion of development. But if we use it as a shortcut to talk about conditions in which human beings can thrive and have dignified lives and in a sustainable environment kind of summarizes what I think of as development.
Jose?
That's a very interesting question. I think that perhaps often what might be more important is not so much replacing the term, but just the fact that we have a discussion about the use of the term. And we have a very interesting reminder about the importance of language occurring to the south of us, in Mexico. There's a lot of discussion in Mexico about 2019 is the 500th anniversary of what? Technically, at its most basic description is Hernan Cortés and a band of illiterate Castilian thugs arrived. I mean, that everybody agrees that happened. Okay, do we want to say, but you know, it's the 500th anniversary of the invasion, the conquest. When I was in high school, it was the discovery, which, and then in 2 years' time, 2021, it will be the 500th anniversary of what? The destruction of Tenochtitlan. Now you say, the destruction of a horrendously oppressive empire that happened to then be replaced by another horrendous repressive empire. I mean, it's kind of a mouthful. And you know, these are not just discussions about intellectuals. These are like, but at the end of the day, what I think is going to be important is what term we use. Is the fact that there's a realization that when you ask yourself just exactly what happened. Just to end, I remember how when I was in high school in Puerto Rico and we studied about the conquest of Mexico, I was taught by nuns, did not appreciate the fine-grained point of history. I don't remember asking this question, you know, how come such a small group of Spaniards defeated so many Aztecs? And I was told, well, they had horses and muskets. I said, how many horses and how many muskets they had? The president of Mexico was taught a history that obviates the fact that Cortés defeated the Aztecs because hundreds of thousands of natives saw in the Spaniards a chance to overthrow what they thought was a dictatorship. So it does matter how we talk about the past. I would say the process is more important than the terms, but I would still be curious to see what term the Mexicans end up with. Because you do have to put it in banners somewhere. 200th anniversary day, okay, so we'll see.
Or at least on Twitter, okay. Your turn. Please, Gary.
First of all, thank you, panel, for your insights and what you've offered. And I have a two-part comment. One part of it is directed at Nina, the other part directed at Jose. But they kind of revolve around a similar theme, and that's kind of with reference to your point, Nina. As we have discussed, I hate the terms global north and global south. I really hate them. I don't know that I like developed and developing any better, but the point, part of it is just the geographic inexactness, you know, of it all. The other part is a point you made about the ideological baggage of the development space, the humanitarian space, the neoliberalism and all that. That's a lot to pack in. All right, and it leads to kind of simplistic conclusions like anything identified as global north bad, anything identified as global south good. So that means, you know, everything about development is a colonial, neo-colonial, neoliberal trope that is imposed on the global south, which has lots of issues. And so I guess I agree with you that certainly people on the development side need to take responsibility for their ideological position, but so do we. You know, I think that very, you know, binary model is probably inadequate to the case, which leads me to Jose. Jose, the marginalized in the world are not necessarily poor, as Pamela's discussion of the elites, you know, where she was referring to, elites in Sudan. But it's not as if the marginalized don't have voices. What we're seeing is in this particular sort of illiberal democracy movement we have around the world, and it's not just the United States and Brazil, it's everywhere. And so I guess I'm wondering that when the marginalization is more a sense of things than a economic condition, we don't like what they're saying. All right, they are voting, they are participating, they are making their voices heard, and they're electing guys we don't like. All right, so I guess I think it's far more complex than the poor are voiceless and therefore need to participate. The thing is, we don't like it sometimes when they participate, and we see this in illiberal democracy. We saw it in the 80s and 90s in political Islam. It's a major issue. So I guess we need to be a little bit more careful with how we look at the analysis of the world.
No, I agree. I think and I have no answer, by the way. I do believe that often, historically, yes, if you ask a question of anyone, your friend, colleague, if it is an honest exercise, you might have to be prepared that you don't like the answer. Now, of course, it has more consequences, but the answers are political actions. I don't have an answer to it other than we just have to have a serious commitment to engagement. I am, part of me, let's take the case of Brazil. We don't tweet about this. I am horrified by the election of Bolsonaro, but I might just say, well, you put people out the slums. I hope you get what you deserve. I said, well, let's just try to understand this. And I do, for example, having had a lot of interaction with the Brazilian left, I do understand that for years, they say, we have some responsibility if we fail to account for some phenomena that just because it doesn't fit our schemes. So I think the only solution to this very complicated problem is continued engagement. But absolutely.
I totally agree.
And we do have to be prepared that this engagement, this dialogue might not be a comfortable one.
So for sure, I was not arguing for any simplistic approach to what is, very, very complex. And part of that is, for example, the complicity of local elites from the beginning of the conquest till today. And so there's no simple good and bad in all of this. But precisely knowledge about that is really important. And if you think of, for example, post-colonial African literature is really giving you all kinds of case studies on the complexity of these issues, collaborations in one way or another, whether it's from Things Fall Apart or Petals of Blood or Season of Migration to the North. I mean, it gives you the better insight into local internal complexities then out vis-a-vis whether it's the colonizers or the neoliberal developers. So that's exactly the complexity that I think is very important in a field where good intentions are always, brought up as, sort of explanation for why we're doing what we're doing. But it has to, we have to just simply achieve a higher level of being informed, really, also about historical knowledge, local knowledge, linguistic literacy, and so forth.
I'm going to add my 2 cents too. I think there's something very different today in the whole development world than 25 years ago. And we cannot neglect the role of social media. And we cannot neglect that aspect of globalization, or as what the Pope has called it, the globalization of intolerance. The fact that politicians everywhere, in the richest countries and in the poorest countries, are able somehow to scapegoat ethnic or religious minorities, to blame others for problems of maldevelopment, if you will, is a phenomenon that's happening globally right now. And this issue of trying to point to others to blame is a universal phenomenon going on in everywhere from China to Chad. So I think this is another issue which brings to the forefront the issues of governance and of, the role of faith-based institutions, the role of community institutions, etc. You cannot think about economic development and poverty reduction without thinking about governance, period. Governance is the thing that's going to make it work or not work, whether there is decent governance or not. Which kind of also comes back to Nina's point about the role of universities. The skills that are needed to actually manage and govern are probably the skills most lacking right now.
A quick, Greg, Zachary, quick interjection. Thank you both, all of you, for this
There's a mic. There's a
well,
mic circulating.
edifying report. Thank you very much. It's broad. I spent 3 years at the Gates Foundation about 10 years ago, and Pamela's point about the convergence of humanitarian intervention with development assistance is really important. And Nina's work on interracial, intercultural marriages similarly has a humanitarian aspect to it. That's the whole basis why the U.S. Constitution allows international marriages. It allows us to pursue happiness. This movement and merger between humanitarian assistance and development aid has occurred so quickly and so rapidly. In the case of Gates, he's first interested in Africa around diseases, malaria, and AIDS. Then, backwards, he has to address development issues. Then, on the flip side, the evangelicals love humanitarian aid, humanitarian interventions. They hate development aid. So, would you say that the best reaction for people of goodwill like us is to say, let's package as humanitarian assistance or humanitarian intervention anything we want, even if it's development assistance, because everyone supports humanitarian assistance and nobody likes development aid, at least in terms of domestic American politics?
Thank you. First of all,
Hang on.
oh, sorry.
Any response from the panel on that?
It's already happening.
Exactly, yes.
Because USAID is not allowed to provide development assistance to many countries under sanction,
Right.
billions of dollars are going into so-called humanitarian aid, which has now expanded to include not just urgent food delivery, but agricultural interventions,
Health.
medical training,
Yeah.
midwifery training, etc. It's just labeled humanitarian aid now, not because of what it is, but because of where it is.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that shift has already happened, and on top of that, there's not even distinction between disaster relief and systemic long-term humanitarian assistance. So I think, that is a very interesting topic.
Please.
Hi, my name's Jamie, and I came here because I've been trying to be a change maker my whole life, and I saw an opportunity because you made this school to actually get a PhD in some vertical thinking to help the world in a big way. And thank you so much for what all three of you said. My question is, what I was thinking is, you know, all of these huge political changes come like passive aggressive, like anger. We're going to finally get engaged because we have to save ourselves because what people are doing to us. And measuring happiness is, you know, the most happiness is when you do business with people you know on your block. And the most effective aid in development and in humanitarian aid has been microloans and like speaking to your point, Nina, about learning the language and how, you know, the whole act and the idea that you said, Jose, about they know what they need. We don't just go in and tell people, here, we're going to help you this way. And there's a shift that way now. How do we shift the whole, in the largest institution, this is an example in the United States, this is going to be in the most innovative, right? So you can circle back around and make the most impact if you're a big institution. How can we, as people who want to do good, shift, or how can the big dollars or big money be shifted, see I said dollars, shifted to better engage, you know, grassroots level organization so that people who know what they want have access to the funding that they need, and then have them eventually, since, you know, re-engage in an emergency way, just as in a, you know, humanitarian aid way, to then go back and become again part of the political process from the grassroots level up, as opposed to being told from the top down what they need and how to get it.
No, again, that's a very deep question. But at least, again, in the context of that I'm more familiar with, I think maybe a good metric to evaluate any policy is, of a policy, specific policy, is the disbursements of funds premise on the people on the ground suffering from massive idiocy. You know, for decades, it was the policy of the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank and USAID that the rapid growth of cities in Latin America was bad. And billions of dollars were spent in programs aimed at preventing migration from the countryside to the city. Now, just stop for a moment and think about that. Say, okay, there are all these people in Brazil, in Colombia, in Mexico moving to the cities. They must not know, they must be mistaken, they don't understand, they don't know what's good for them. Don't you know how bad things in Sao Paulo? And invariably, if you will ask one of those migrating peasants, don't you know how bad it is in Mexico City? They would say, do you know how bad it is in the countryside? So it was only a few years ago that the World Bank officially acknowledged the failure of its policies aimed at preventing people from moving to cities. I would have said, to me so here's a very simple criteria. Any development policy that in effect is premised on you're trying to change the behavior of people because they don't know what's good for them is probably going to be a waste of money. And I said, many billions of dollars were wasted in Latin America, in Africa. I'm not glorifying living in slums, in cities, but anyway, but I'm sure we could draw a very long list of criteria for many programs. But to me, that's one of them. Yeah.
I think we should very quickly also think about a lot of the reasons for poverty in the world today, and that has a lot to do with neoliberal capitalism, and the last 30, 40 years have increased global inequality. So for me, there's this intrinsic connection between these neoliberal economic policies, and the strategies include debt politics, they include subsidized agriculture in the global north, they include currency politics that have disadvantaged exactly those areas that then receive development aid or humanitarian assistance. And that is the key problem that we need to tackle. So as long as we're just providing band-aids or hush money, I mean, in a way, humanitarian aid is hush money for some of the other very exploitative measures that are carried out globally with the support of local elites, but that produce more poor people on this planet. And I think that is exactly what should be also the key issue of the education of the future development workers, and awareness, and also in economic literacy.
Just to say a word, I think a very interesting example of some of this is that if we look recently at the migration across the Mediterranean to Europe, and the European Union's interest in stopping this migration after the influx of Syrians and others a couple of years ago, they established a big fund, which was a development fund, because the notion was, maybe if we invest in the countries that these people are coming from, that will stop them from coming. And anybody who studies migration at all would know immediately that this is a really counterproductive strategy. They said, there are a lot of Gambians coming, there are some Ghanaians, there are some Senegalese coming on the western route through Libya. Let us invest in some productive activities in those countries. Wonderful. Investment, very nice. It provided some more employment in those countries, but the migration increased. Why? Because it's never the poorest of the poor who move. Never. And they didn't realize that, hey, you give people a little bit of hope, they know more, they know other people there, they get a phone, they get on social media, they know that their cousin is doing pretty well there in Italy or France or Germany or something, and they're going to try to go because they owe it to their family to provide some support. So it's such an interesting counterproductive policy there. At the same time, it was European countries who worked for 20 years to establish basic minimum standards of humanitarian support. There are standards that exist for anybody responding in any humanitarian setting, on food, on shelter, on water, on health, even on women's health. on hygiene, etc. European Union did not even apply those standards as people were crossing into Europe, and now are using this notion of we need to stop supporting interception and NGOs in the Mediterranean because we're trying to save lives. So it's completely geared toward the constituents in Europe and their xenophobic attitude, but put in the language somehow of humanitarianism. We're not going to rescue people in the Mediterranean now because that will just encourage more to come, so we're saving lives by not doing it.
We've got a last quick question, Netra.
I think we don't have a whole lot of time here. I just want to thank the panelists for enlightening us in this very important topic of the 21st century, and Dave for fascinating. I have a very quick question, because what I heard in many different forms is the need for inclusiveness. And in this room, we have quite a bit of graduate students and ourselves engaging on producing knowledge for the future. So if there's one thing that you can suggest them about how to produce knowledge that is inclusive, by being inclusive, so that it is going to be useful to the very society it has been produced for. I would appreciate that.
Like 30 seconds each.
Yep.
I think what I said is, my presentation spoke to that, right? So that historical knowledge, cultural linguistic literacy, and ability to engage with local stakeholders is key to that.
And for all the challenges and problems that we've highlighted up here, I'm actually very optimistic, because I think young people are becoming more and more educated, more and more involved politically, and more concerned about these issues all over the world, both in the so-called North and in other countries as well.
I think that's a very important question. I think that to our graduate students, we should instill in them a view that data about communities is part of their assets. It's not a commodity. And that the communities that generate data and that are studied should have a say in how the data is used, and that the gathering of data and the creation of data sets is a joint exercise. And that we should see data, especially in the context where data about urban areas is increasingly seen as a commodity, is increasingly seen as a source of loss of money, including by universities, by the way, including ASU, but that's another panel. I think it's very important that we embody the value that data is not a commodity. Data is a public good, and you should respect the people who generate the data and should give them a voice in what you're going to do with the data about them. That is, I think, something we can enact in our graduate programs. That does not require a social revolution.
And for my 30 seconds, I would pick up on the word that was coming from Netra's final remarks, and the name of the School for the Future of Innovation Society, the future. We have a motto for the school that the future is for everyone. And if what we've heard from the panel means something to me in that frame, it's that people should have the maximal role in determining what their own futures are going to be. That helps us get around that challenging word for development. And yes, Nina, there are lots of different ways that different cultures and different languages approach the future, but the sun still rises on everyone tomorrow. And figuring out how it is that we all together collectively create a future for us as individuals, as families, as communities, as nation states, if those things continue to exist, I think is at the core of a large common part of our project. So thank you to the panel, thank you to the audience. Megan has just a little announcement before we go.
Thank you to Clint and team.
I just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists for being here today. We really enjoyed your discussion, and thank you, Dr. Guston, for moderating. And thank everyone in the audience as well for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to the ideas that we're discussing in this venue and also in our program.
As Kevin mentioned earlier, this talk series is an ongoing and really important piece of the IBD PhD program, and will be continuing in the fall, using the discussions that we had here today as the springboard for the topics that we'll be discussing then. So the theme for the fall is going to be disrupting the future. So we look forward to seeing you there, and hopefully we'll have